Welcome to Social Justice Warrior Training. I'm Reagan and I'm your moderator for today. We have our guest Maria and our founder of Platform, Dr. Ju, with us today. So Maria, first off, before we get into our topic of self-love, what is your passion in social justice?
Hi, so my name is Maria Ignacia. I use she, her, and ella pronouns. And my passion for social justice is really grew from the classes and the stuff that I did when I was in high school, and then progressed and really transformed when I got to college, where I got to organize with a lot of my peers. And so the main social justice issue that I feel really connected to is labor politics and labor justice, but currently work in environmental health, and really looking at the intersectionality of all of that.
To start off with, what do you think the definition of self-preservation means to you?
Yeah, I had to look it up. So the definition that I found was that it's the act of preserving oneself from harm or death. And I hadn't really heard, the way that I've heard self-preservation in the past is when we talk about cultures, and especially Native and Indigenous cultures and immigrant cultures. But to me, when I hear it now and in the context of self-care, it's really about making sure that that you find ways and things that make you happy and that are able to help you cope with the stress and the difficulty of living in our society and the world that we currently have. And so, yeah.
I have a question following that. We talk about self-preservation. And so the question is, how do you differentiate that from coping mechanisms?
That's hard. So I am not a trained therapist or psychologist, and nor do I claim to be. But the way that I understood it is that coping mechanisms and what some people call like self-soothing is really about managing more immediately the stress and the trauma that you're going through at the moment. And then self-preservation is more about the long-term things that you do to be able to maintain yourself, right? And really to take care of yourself. At least that's the way that I understand it.
And I actually want to talk to both of you about that. If I come home after work and find a quart of ice cream and start eating it, is that self-care or coping mechanism, and why?
I would ask you, like, why do you have to come home? Like, do you come home and eat ice cream because that's just what you do and you love ice cream and you just felt like eating ice cream? Or are you using it because something traumatic or stressful happened earlier in your day and that's how you feel like coping with it?
Well, it was a very bad day. So if I come after a very bad day, it's stress related. Mm-hmm. So I come home. If I eat a quart of ice cream, I'm taking care of myself. I feel that I'm being good to myself, taking care of some of the negative feelings that I have. And so from my perspective, it's a form of self-care. Mm. Do you agree or disagree, and why?
I would personally disagree and say it's more of a coping mechanism. Although it may feel like self-care at the moment, right? But because self-care is more, it's a little bit closer to self-preservation, where it's really looking at like the long-term effects of things that take care of you, right? Reagan?
Yeah, Reagan, what do you think? I'm curious.
I also agree that it's a form of a coping mechanism, because I look at self-care to be kind of, if it's stress related, it's dealing with the source of stress and turning it around to not be so stressful, and you're dealing with it in the moment by eating the ice cream.
So you say ice cream is bad for me then? I'm curious.
No, so that's the other, I was going to mention that too, is that I feel like that's the other thing that there's a really negative connotation with coping mechanisms that we associate as a society, as like people, that coping mechanisms tend to be bad, right? Because some people use drugs, other people will use food, and they have this like negative connotation, but it doesn't necessarily have to be negative, right? It's just helping you get through that tough, like stressful moment at the time, but it doesn't mean it's a long-term solution to the problem or to whatever you're going through, right? It's about short term, like how do we get through this like next day, through this next week, right? Understanding that it will be stressful or it will be traumatic, right? So I worked at a really stressful and toxic job, and the way that I found I had to cope sometimes was by like going to Target and buying things, right? It was just like useless stuff that I didn't need, and that I didn't necessarily want, but I just like walked into Target and I was like, okay, like today I'm spending $20 on whatever I want, right? And I thought it was self-care, but it was a way that my brain and my body and that I had to cope with the stress of a really toxic work environment, right?
So going to Target, you're saying is a coping mechanism. Now, give me an example of how you should have dealt with that stress at work. In other words, what would have been a self-care response or a self-preservation response that would have been different than just a coping mechanism, that immediate response to the stress?
Yeah, so a few different ones. I should have started going to therapy a lot earlier. And I should have, because I had the means to be able to go to therapy, and so I should have been able to find a therapist. That's a little harder, and I feel like a little bit more hands-on, but something that's a lot easier to do is like going home and taking deep breaths and meditating, or having the time and taking the time to slow down, or even just sleeping, right? Like I was already tired, and instead of going home, I would go to Target to spend money, right? And so if I would have just gone home and like made myself a meal or worked out instead, then it could have been a healthier, and it could have been a different like self-care routine, right?
This is what I want to get at, is the routine. Now, Reagan, I want you to tell me, because I want to hear from you, and I'm going to break it down for you because I'm curious. So Reagan, if you had a week in which you have a lot of tests, because finals are coming up, and so you have papers and exams at school, and you have some students, I don't know if it's a similar situation, have family issues or have friend issues or have medical issues. There's a lot of issues that students deal with in addition to schoolwork. So the question is, how would coping mechanisms differ from self-care? So how do you do self-care? Yeah, unmute yourself, Reagan. Reagan, I can't hear you. I think there's a bad connection again. Shoot. Try again. No. While she's getting that, the reason why I stay away from the word self-care and routine is that ultimately preservation is what we're aiming for. And so it's ultimately dealing with the source, Maria, right? And therapy allowed you to deal with the source. The thing is, you quit that job. And so that was the source of the stress. Work is not always stressful. So the question is this: why was that place stressful, and how did you come around to understanding why it was a source of stress? And how do you dissect it so that you are dealing with the source, not with the symptoms? Does that make sense?
Kind of. Oh, Reagan, I think we can hear you again, actually.
Okay.
No?
No, shift that again. I think a few seconds ago it was on, I believe. No. I don't know what's wrong with that connection. So Maria, do you know what I'm asking?
No. Try again.
You're dealing with the symptoms by doing a routine. We're talking about meditation and we're taking walks. But in that meditation, while you're walking, you're actually trying to reflect on what the problem of the source is. It was that workspace, which from the place you quit. That quitting was actually self-preservation. It was not a coping mechanism. It was not a self-care routine. So the difference between self-preservation and self-care, there's a huge distinction. And what is that distinction, you believe, that allows you to quit that space?
Yeah, now that you put it that way, I see what you mean by the difference, but I don't know if I can articulate it.
Okay. Well, I'll come back to you. Reagan, can you no? Okay. The difference is this. The reason why I like the word self-love or self-preservation as opposed to self-care is because self-care has been commercialized. It's a day at the spa. It's going to the expensive retreat. It's getting my nails done. It is baking. It's basically doing things that requires us buying or purchasing things that we think will give us relief. It's also, to be honest, it seems like more of a coping mechanism than it is actually dealing with the source of the problem. And self-preservation helps us deal with the source by trying to figure out why is that space causing so much stress? Why is the schoolwork causing us so much stress? Is it that we need to shift our attitude? Is it because we need to leave that space because it's not using our strength? Is it because the dynamic within that space is not healthy? Do you see what the difference is?
Yeah, and I would agree with, I agree with you that that's the difference between self-preservation and self-care. But I also understand that sometimes you're not in a spot to be able to tackle the thing that would lead you to self-preservation, right? And all you can do is self-care and return to your coping mechanisms. That's why it's important for us to also have self-care routines and things that we do that are healthier, right, for us, for our bodies, and for our mind.
So self-preservation, self-care, and coping mechanisms all could be in place to help you deal with what it is affecting you.
Yeah, they're all things that lead you to self-preservation, right, in the long term.
They're part of the self-preservation. Right. Self-preservation is the larger and everything underneath it. But ultimately, the goal is to get to the source of the stress and to figure out what we can do in terms of change things that would help us not get to that place of stress.
Yeah, because if you live your entire life like stressed or under trauma, right, that you have to do these self-care routines, and you'll never reach that like self-preservation, and you'll never lead the life that you need to, right? You'll always be just dealing with like immediate and short-term stress. Yeah.
Reagan, is your mic on?
I think so.
Yes. So what are your thoughts in terms of, because your heavy week is coming up soon, how do you deal with stress?
Related to like school?
Yeah, relate to school with anything that is in your life, happening in your life. Because I think one of the things which is underappreciated by adults is the amount of stress that students go through, young people go through. Y'all have so much on your plates that we believe, since you don't have to since we support you, y'all should not have any problems, which is not the case. So first, let's think about this. What are your stressors? What causes stress for you? How do you deal with them?
I think some parts of school is definitely a cause of stress, especially tests or like quizzes that we're taking, especially with finals week coming up. It's definitely been a little stressful trying to study for everything. And figuring out how finals are going to work because each teacher's doing them differently this year and everyone's switching everything around. And so I've been trying to take more like breaks from studying instead of constantly trying to study, just taking a break and going on a hike or taking my dog on a walk or just doing something that brings me happiness, that and then I'll come back after like 10 minutes or 20 minutes and I'll try it again and I'll work through it or ask for help if I can't figure it out.
Have you been in a situation or have you had to deal with school or non-school related things that was too overwhelming? And at that point, what did you do?
I can't think of anything that has been super overwhelming. I typically like school, but yeah.
Well, the reason why I say this is because I put such undue stress on my body and myself when I was young to get straight A's.
Yeah.
That it was extremely unhealthy. That I would not sleep, that I would not eat well, that it cut to a point where I just hurt myself because I did not perform well. And so at that point, I wish someone would have said that you don't need to put that kind of pressure on yourself. So my self-care would have been that I stop, like you, to take a walk and take a deep breath and come back to my studies. I did not do that. Self-preservation would have been that I needed to change the way my attitude towards about studies. It is not the end all be all. If I don't go to great college, it's not the end of my life. If I don't get straight A's, the world will not end. And yet we put that stress on ourselves. And this is the hardest part. For me to take a walk, and this is, I don't know if it's a cultural thing, I felt guilty. And that's something that I hear from a lot of women who take time away. And you could talk to me about this, Maria, if you heard this. When you take time, especially if you have children and you have a husband, or you have a parent who needs your help, if you take an hour out of the day to just go for a walk, an hour of the day to watch TV, they will say either you are irresponsible, lazy, selfish, which is the word that I hear a lot, thoughtless. And so the idea is, if I do take time to take care of myself, to preserve myself, that it's basically, I'm not being a good woman, I'm not being a good mother, and I'm a horrible wife. Not that I'm a wife, but these are the things that you hear. Maria, do you hear some of this too?
I don't think I've heard it a lot, like directed at me. But I do remember my mom pushing herself to that edge a lot when I was younger. Like, I have a very distinct and emotional memory of like my mom cleaning up my toys when I was little, and her just like breaking down and like laying down on my bed and crying. And I was like, Mom, like, why are you crying? And I remember her telling me, she's just like, all I do is clean. Like, she's like, I clean and I clean and I clean. And then you come and like get everything messed up again. And like, all I need you to do is clean up your toys. Right. And I just remember like, I don't remember her like crying very often. Right. Because of that, like that was just very specific. But I do remember her like pushing herself to like clean every week and do the groceries and like laundry and like take care of us, right? And especially after we moved to the United States, she worked part-time, and my dad worked full-time, and she still did everything in the home. She had like an extra, she was working and also supporting like with income, not as much as my dad, but and then she would still come home and clean and do everything that was like required of her as like a housewife, right? And never taking time to herself. I remember I might have been like 13 or 14. Like we were trying to figure out what we were going to get her for Christmas, and we were somewhere and we ended up getting her like a gift card to a spa. And it was like, she was like, this is like the first time that I have that I have been able to like take time to do something like for myself, and I feel like that's really embedded in immigrant culture, especially if your parents come here and they're like, I'm giving you a better life, like it's just really interesting because they tell you like, I'm here so that you have more opportunities and you get to live a better life, right? But if we do take time for ourselves, sometimes there is this like backwards like comments that we do hear of and of like making us feel guilty that we are able to take time off, that we are able to take vacations, right? When a lot of immigrant parents and immigrant folks out there haven't had the chance to do that. Yeah, sometimes it feels like you just have to go all the time to meet your purpose.
Well, no, I think guilt plays a huge role. And I'm curious, Reagan, do you feel guilty as well?
I guess it depends on what I'm doing.
Well, give me an example when you have felt guilt.
I was studying for a big math test I had on Friday, a couple weeks ago, and I'd been studying for like an hour, and I was getting kind of stressed because I couldn't figure out one of my problems. And so with that, I was gonna take a break, and I ended up going and watching like a Christmas movie, and then my mom was like, just come take a break, you need to like stop worrying about this math test. And I ended up doing pretty well without taking that extra time, but I remember feeling kind of guilty because I was taking time to do something kind of fun.
You felt guilty, you did well without doing the work. How fascinating.
Well, sometimes your brain needs a rest.
Well, no, but it's interesting because you feel like you have to do the work to earn it. And it seems like you felt guilty because you felt like you didn't earn it. You didn't deserve it. Is that correct, Reagan?
Kind of. I felt guilty for taking a break from studying, but I felt like I earned the math test because math is not my strongest subject, and I had been studying and putting a lot of effort into it, and I ended up getting a good grade, which is good, and it helped my final grade. So,
well, it's interesting. I want to talk about Maria and what you were talking about, Reagan. Is self-care a luxury? I'm not talking about the money aspect of it. So if you are a poor immigrant family, and I grew up in one, you hold 2-3 jobs to make ends meet. And so the idea, forget the guilt, the selfishness, whatever, the idea is you don't have time to take an hour off. And so if you do take you just don't have time. So is that a luxury? Is self-care something only us privileged people could do? And we can't afford that 10 minutes or the hour that will give us the energy to reboot, to have our energy back. I'm curious because that's something I've heard. It's like, on the one hand, you're being selfish for taking time off. The other hand is, well, how can you find? Because I get this from people who work a lot of jobs and say, it's because you're rich or it's because you have a great job or something that you can take an hour off. Is it a luxury? Both?
I have a lot of feelings and emotions about this. Reagan, if you would like to go first.
She needs to collect her emotions. Can you go first, Reagan? Oh, you're muted again, Reagan. That's the mic. No, it's muted again, Reagan. While she gets that, Maria, why don't you respond?
I feel like, yes, there is, that's such a hard question because it is associated with having privilege and being able to take time off, but it shouldn't be. It should, and I know there's like a big gap between like what it should be and how it is. But yes, at the moment it is something that folks who have money, if you have like a stable job, if you have stable income, right, you're able to do that. But I don't think it should be associated with that, right? I think anyone should be able to take care of themselves, right? And not necessarily have to be in survival mode 24/7. So my hope and thoughts are that at some point in one day we all can take time, even if it is 10 minutes, like you say, Sam, to be able to take care of ourselves and to do self-care.
I'm curious, Reagan, what are your thoughts about what I said? Because is it a luxury?
I think that it can be a luxury depending on how you look at it. But if you take some of the small things that you do and turn that into self-care, that works also, if that makes sense.
And that's the thing is, how can we construct the concept of self-care, self-preservation, so that everyone can do it? The problem with the way self-care has been commercialized, the way in which we talk about self-care, it sounds like that it is a luxury, right? And so my thing, that's why I'm trying to shift away from that language, actually, to self-preservation. The idea is, if you don't take care of yourself, if you don't deal with the issues that create the stress, then you're actually killing yourself. It is taking the 5 minutes off. It is telling the family, hey, I'm going to sit there for 10 minutes. Don't bother me. It's saying to your children, hey, mom needs a little break. And it's not about saying, give me a weekend so that I could go off to the wine country to drink some red wine and enjoy myself. It doesn't mean that. And it also does not mean that I'm being selfish. And this is a cultural thing too, to say that, or a gender issue, to say that I have to always sacrifice my time, my energy for everyone else. I cannot take time to be kind to myself. And that's why I keep on using the word self-preservation in the question that I sent to you guys, as opposed to self-care. And that's because I'm resisting this notion that self-care is for the privileged. Any final questions or thoughts?
I wanted to touch on community care as well, because I know
Yes.
that's something that you didn't mention or
Thank
talk
you.
about.
Mhm.
But so the definition of community care is really any care provided by other people or institutions around you. And I really like to talk and emphasize community care when I talk about this issue sometimes, even with friends, because self-care is insinuated as like an individualized routine and things that we do personally to take care of ourselves, but as human beings we are not, we were never meant to survive on our own. And so if we understand that we have other things around us and other people and other institutions that can help us, then that's really key in, like you say, Sam, self-preservation, because we need one another to be able to survive, right? And some examples of community care are therapy, spending time with family or loved ones, community centers and community spaces, church or faith if you are religious. And then there's also community efforts to take care of one another, right? And that's what we see with like food and clothing drives or food pantries or community fridges. There's a community fridge here in Denver that's getting started, which is really cool. Where people, because food pantries require a lot of non-perishables, and there have been different people are now doing also community fridges where there's like fridges that kind of pop up in different spaces and in different places, and you can make a meal or you can buy things that are not necessarily um, or that are perishable and you can put them there and people can access them like no questions asked, right? It's really taken care of by community. um, and yeah, understanding that sometimes you need to spend time with other people to be able to take care of yourself, which I know is really hard during this time, and as a extrovert has been really difficult because my self-care personally is spending time with other people, and the way that I do self-preservation as well is traveling, and that's not something that I've been able to do. And so I've had to get creative and figure out other means to be able to cope and get through the situation, right?
And
Mhm.
I'm glad you talked about that because it's in giving and receiving. It's the institutions that also need to step up on this concept of caring for others. It's the way that my church provides sleeping bags for people, and they also have a one night a week. When before the pandemic they had family night in which moms didn't have to cook and they could just go to church, pay a little money, and then everyone could eat. So it's the institutions that needs to step up to help each other, and most importantly, what it's to be able to receive that, to be able to say I need it, therefore I'm going to take that 1 week off, 1 day off of the week, not cook, and receive the meal from someone else. Thank you.
Yeah, and
Reagan?
understand too that um, you may need community care from other people and from other places, but you are also community care for other folks.
Yes.
And in order for you to be able to be the good community care that other people need, you have to take care of yourself first as well, right?
Absolutely.
And you have to be able to be in a space to do that, to be able
Yes.
to give.
Thank you, Maria. Final thoughts, Reagan?
I think for me at least, community care is also self care, and it can give you that time off to take care of other people and let you stop worrying about other things while also helping make a small difference in someone else's life or making you feel good about it.
Yes. Thank you both for being in the space. Really appreciate it. You are our last guest, actually. So,
Thank you for having me. I love having this conversation all the time, and I feel like I talk about this like with my family members and with my friends and my network and at work all the time. Not in a structured way like this, but so it's really nice to be able to share that with other folks too. So thank you for having me.